So I'm going to talk about panpsychism, in particular Russellian panpsychism. So there will be some connection to some of the things that Daniel Stolzer talked about earlier this morning. So you will have noticed that panpsychism is becoming more and more popular in the contemporary literature, and there are a number of sort of considerations that are given in favor of this position, and I'm going to raise some worries about some of those considerations. So I'm going to talk about what I call the causal argument for a Russellian version of panpsychism, and I'm going to argue that that argument actually has serious problems. So panpsychism here, of course, there are different views which might be called panpsychism. I'm going to take this view to be the following: phenomenal consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of reality. This is how contemporary panpsychists are sort of describing the view here. Being is phenomenal conscious when there's something it is like to be. It a property, in the sense, is a phenomenal conscious property. If there's something it is like to instantiate that property in a mental state, likewise, it's phenomenal conscious in the sense, if there's something it is like to be in that state. So the idea here is that if panpsychism is true, consciousness in this sense is both basic and pretty much everywhere, the fundamental reality. So Chalmers, for example, here describes the view in the following way. So all members of fundamental physical types, all photons, for example, have phenomenally conscious mental states. Well, if this view is true, then arguably there is something it is like to be a quark or a photon or a member of some other fundamental physical type. So clearly, by taking consciousness to be a fundamental feature of reality, I think panpsychists are very clearly sort of departing from physicalist accounts of consciousness. And by taking it to be ubiquitous, I think they are departing in some sense from common sense, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, I think the proponents, contemporary proponents, admit that in some sense, the view departs from common sense. So they admit openly that it is a, seriously counterintuitive view in some sense, but they argue that there are certain theoretical advantages for or of panpsychism over competing accounts of consciousness. So, for example, Chalmers, says there are indirect reasons of a broadly theoretical character for taking the view seriously, and Goff, in his joint work with Sam Coleman, is suggesting that at the end of the day, good arguments and the theoretical advantages of a theory ought to be taken more seriously than common sense intuition. And I agree with these methodological claims. Now, but the question is, what are the theoretical advantages of panpsychism over competing accounts of consciousness? So the one that I'm going to focus on is the following. So according to, I think, common narrative in the contemporary panpsychist literature, the idea is, in explaining mental causation, panpsychism turns out to be better equipped than other non-physicalist theories about consciousness. So assuming that physicalism is false, then panpsychism, or some specific version of panpsychism, turns out to be the most credible view in explaining consciousness and solving the mind-body problem. So I'm going to call this the causal argument for panpsychism. It is assuming physicalism is false, given that among non-physicalist theories, panpsychism, or a version of it, turns out to explain mental causation in a uniquely successful way, then it turns out to be the most credible view. So that's what I take to be the causal argument for panpsychism. So clearly, the argument has sort of a negative and a positive sort of step, right? The negative one is this, right? So the idea is other non-physicalist theories cannot explain mental causation. And as we will see shortly, proponents of this argument typically focus on dualism here when they say other non-physicalist theories cannot explain mental causation. And the positive claim is that panpsychism does explain mental causation. And again, as we will see shortly, the focus here is a Russellian version of panpsychism. So that version is supposed to explain mental causation. So when you put these things together, then panpsychism or Russellian panpsychism turns out to be the sort of the most credible way of solving the mind body problem. So I think there are problems with both of these claims, both the negative and the positive claim. And the rest of the talk will be sort of try to illustrate this. So throughout this discussion, I'm going to assume that physicalism is false. And not because I think it is false. I actually have not still made up my mind about this. But the issue here is that, as you will see, the talk is in some sense a comparison of two different non-physicalist theories of consciousness. So I think it is just very convenient here to just assume that physicalism is false. All right. So as I said, the version that I'm going to be focusing on, the one actually which has received a lot of attention in the contemporary literature is Russellian panpsychism. But before we get to the Russellian version of this, just I think it is important to appreciate that panpsychism is compatible with different sort of views about the relationship between conscious properties and physical properties. So, for example, so remember, panpsychism here is the view that consciousness is both fundamental and ubiquitous. So you could be a dualist and think that sort of photons and quarks and whatever other fundamental physical entities we want to attribute consciousness to, they might have these conscious mental states over and above their physical properties. But also you can depart from that kind of dualist approach. And the version that we will be talking about today is actually a monist account of the mind or the mental sort of physical properties. Mental and physical properties. So this is going to be a form of Russellian monism that we've seen earlier this morning as well. So, I'm going to be a little bit sort of crude with my characterization of Russellian monism, particularly after this morning's talk. So I'm going to be a little bit more brief here. So I'm going to take Russellian monism, the generic view, so not Russellian panpsychism, Russellian monism more generally, to be the view that both consciousness and dispositional, relational, structural aspects of concrete reality as described by physics are grounded in instances of properties that belong to one fundamental kind. So I'm going to take these properties that belong to this one fundamental kind, RM properties, RM obviously for Russellian monism, so Russellian monist properties. So I'm sort of putting sort of dispositional, relational, structural all together, and there might be certain problems there, especially after some of the discussion this morning. But this is something that we see a lot in the Russellian panpsychist literature as well. In any case, I'll actually be focusing on dispositional sort of part of this this formula. So then the idea here is that these RM properties are meant to be categorical properties. So they are not dispositional properties because they are the categorical grounds of dispositions. And as we've already seen this morning, so these properties are relevant to phenomenal consciousness in some sense. So now consider a version of this generic Russellian monist view in which these RM properties are themselves phenomenal properties. So, on this view, then there would be something it is like to have an RM property, such a categorical property. So this is going to be a version of panpsychism because RM properties are fundamental properties to begin with, right? So they are the sort of categorical grounds of physical dispositions of fundamental physical entities, and also they are everywhere. So so RM properties are ubiquitous in that sense. So in this view, then consciousness becomes both fundamental and ubiquitous. That is why this version is going to be a panpsychist view. So then we can understand Russellian panpsychism as the following view: the fundamental categorical properties that ground dispositional properties of physical objects and conscious experiences of ordinary creatures like us are phenomenal properties. So this is how I understand Russellian panpsychism. So as you can see that, given that these categorical properties, which are phenomenal properties, they ground physical dispositions, they do seem to have some kind of a role in causation. So that is the idea behind the causal argument for Russellian panpsychism. So the people who have sort of given versions of this argument have been very, I think, clear on this. For example, Chalmers says, look, dualism has the familiar problem of mental causation, whereas panpsychism does not suffer from these problems. So in this view, phenomenal properties are integrated into the causal order. And Mork, for example, says that unlike dualism, again, the comparison is with dualism, such a view offers phenomenal properties and explanatory role in physical world compatible with physical causal closure. So this, the idea that, so there seems to be a problem for dualism when it comes to explaining mental causation, and that problem seems to do with the idea that the physical world is causally closed. I will get to this point in some detail in a second. And Philip Goff and Sam Coleman, so when they actually talk about Russellian monism more generally, both in sort of panpsychist and non-panpsychist versions, they say such a view avoids the dualist difficulties reconciling the efficacy of consciousness with the causal closure of the physical world. And so the idea here is then, in some sense, and this is something that we see a lot in the relevant recent literature on panpsychism. So the dualism seems to suffer from this problem of mental causation, in making somehow compatible with the idea that the physical world is causally closed. And in some sense, that is supposed to be really bad for dualism, because it looks like dualism is contradicting the claims of the physical sciences, as Robert Howell puts it. So, well, what is the idea here? That dualism, the view that mental properties, or phenomenal properties, are distinct from physical properties, fundamental physical properties. So, what is the sort of why is the view, in some sense, sort of mysterious or contradictory in relation to the claims of the physical sciences? So here I think the Russellian panpsychists are relying on an argument which originally is an argument against dualism that is given by physicalist philosophers, right? So this is the argument that, well, given the causal closure of the physical, there doesn't seem to be any causal role for non-physical phenomenal properties. But how do we put that in terms of an argument? And the classical move here, I think, that the Russellian panpsychists are relying on in the negative part of their causal argument for panpsychism is the causal exclusion argument. It goes like this. I'm going to be very brief with my presentation of the causal exclusion argument. So this is the idea that, well, look, if dualism is true, then mental properties, phenomenal properties, are distinct from physical properties. Well, the physical is causally closed. That is, every event that has a cause at a time has a sufficient physical cause at that time. So then it looks like if phenomenal properties have any causal role, they have to find some way of sort of being relevant in this causally closed physical system. Now, the exclusion principle that is really essential to this causal exclusion argument is that no effect has more than one simultaneous sufficient cause unless it is a case of causal overdetermination. And cases of mental causation, cases where phenomenal properties are causally relevant, are not cases of causal overdetermination. So when you put these three premises together, you get the conclusion that if dualism is true, then phenomenal properties cannot be causally relevant because they have no role to play in a physical, causally closed physical world without causally overdetermining their effects. And they can't do that given the exclusion principle. So, I mean, there's a lot to say about the causal exclusion argument. And I'm going to be relatively brief here because I really want to focus on panpsychism here. But the first thing to say here is that this argument is, as I said, typically and traditionally given by physicalist philosophers against dualism. So I think there's going to be some kind of a problem here with putting the idea behind this argument within the general panpsychist picture, which is a non-physicalist picture. So the problems that I'm going to raise against the causal argument are related to this, this dialectical tension. And when I'm talking about the causal exclusion argument, I'm just going to assume that the exclusion principle is true. I actually don't think that it is true, but I just want to play along in some sense, just to see sort of where the causal exclusion argument is going to take us. So, and the main problem that I want to raise here is that there's a problem here by invoking the causal exclusion argument in the context of discussing or assessing non-physicalist theories. So the relevant non-physicalist theories here are dualism and panpsychism. So in particular, I think there are two main problems here. One of them has to do with the claim that the causal, so the physical domain is causally closed. I think, you know, there are going to be certain problems about, you know, endorsing this premise in this context. And also, I think there are problems with dismissing dualism on the basis of the conclusion of the causal exclusion argument. The conclusion being dualism entails epiphenomenalism. So even if you agree with the exclusion principle and the causal closure of the physical, and the conclusion of the causal exclusion argument follows, I think there is going to be a problem here by dismissing dualism based on the implication of epiphenomenalism. So I take epiphenomenalism to be the view that mental properties are causally inefficacious. So just to briefly clarify what I mean by these two problems. The first one with the causal exclusion, the causal closure of the physical principle. So I think, I mean, we need sort of more arguments to sort of make this point, but I think it is sort of broadly, it's commonly agreed that this is a broadly physicalist assumption, the idea that the physical domain is causally closed. I know that some dualists do agree with this assumption, and that is why they want to be epiphenomenalists, and that's why I think there are certain problems with dismissing dualism for epiphenomenalism. But regardless of that, I think it is clear that this is a broadly physicalist assumption. And in fact, it is explicitly rejected by many dualists and very consciously sort of ardently sort of rejected by sort of certain property dualists. For example, those who think that mental properties are strongly emergent properties. So in that sense, I think it is not really legitimate to sort of just accept this premise within the context of assessing dualism and move on. So I think there are certain questions about this principle. But I think more importantly, so there is this sort of narrative here that we see again and again, that when dualists are in some sense violating the causal closure of the physical, in some sense they are sort of contradicting the physical sciences. But I think that really oversimplifies dualism's relationship the possibility and the mechanisms of mental causation. First of all, this principle is not really a principle of physics, and you know, even the sort of the most ardent proponents of this principle do admit this, right? So you don't find this principle in any physics textbook, as Popino says, for example. And also, it is not entailed by laws of physics. So I'm not a physicist, so I can't be sort of very, very confident with this claim, but I think there's some really interesting discussion of this, and in papers by you know, people, including actually Barbara Montero, who's one of the speakers in this workshop, that you really need to assume quite a lot of metaphysical claims about the nature of the mental and the physical to really get anything like the causal closure of the physical from, for example, conservation laws of physics. So in that sense, I think the causal closure of the physical is essentially a metaphysical thesis. And actually, there are two reasons for this, right? One of them is that it really depends on certain assumptions about the nature of the mental and the physical. So if you think that you know, there are no irreducibly non-physical sui generis mental forces, then perhaps you can sort of support a principle like that from laws of physics. But this is exactly the kind of thing that some dualists are assuming. And also, I think it really relies on certain claims about causation. And there are certain theories that are invoked in the contemporary mental causation debate, which explicitly which are used explicitly sort of to argue against the causal closure principle. So I think these really suggest that the principle is really a metaphysical principle. So I don't think that, you know, you can dismiss as a panpsychist here dualism for contradicting science here. And finally, and this is really sort of a personal intuition rather than an argument, but I think the view that the causal closure of the physical fails is in some sense less incredible than the claim that there is something it is like to be a photon or a quark. But as I said, this is just a personal intuition. But I think intuitions to some extent play a role in this debate. Now the second issue was the dismissal of dualism on the basis of its implication of epiphenomenalism. So let's say that, you know, causal closure of the physical does actually hold, and the exclusion principle is true. And let's say that because of these, dualism entails epiphenomenalism. Here, now the question is, can panpsychists really dismiss dualism because of this? And I think there are problems here. The first one the first problem here is that, like, what is the problem with epiphenomenalism? So, I mean, the idea that our mental properties have no role whatsoever in no causal role whatsoever in our life is clearly a counterintuitive sort of claim. But I think we are in agreement here that in some sense, sort of counterintuitiveness of a theory shouldn't be a decisive factor against the theory, because we have some textual evidence that, you know, panpsychists do think that counterintuitiveness shouldn't be a decisive factor. But I think there's a more serious worry with epiphenomenalism, namely that, well, it seems to be in tension with the idea that so we are agents in our actions, right? So we have agency in action. So if our mental properties have no role whatsoever in our actions, then there's going to be a certain problem with the idea that we are capable of acting freely. Now, so although I think that is actually a real worry with epiphenomenalism, here, I don't think it is really relevant within the context of debating panpsychism, because panpsychism is a view about phenomenal consciousness. Therefore, the kind of dualism that we are contrasting panpsychism with is also a view about phenomenal consciousness. And if the causal exclusion argument is right, then dualism in that sense implies only epiphenomenalism about phenomenal consciousness. And it is not so clear that epiphenomenalism about phenomenal consciousness implies that we lack the capacity to act. So the kind of epiphenomenalism that is relevant in the agency debate is epiphenomenalism about propositional attitudes like beliefs and desires. And the causal exclusion argument, when it is restricted to consciousness, doesn't really say anything about this. And also there are sort of maybe more relevant reasons here to sort of dismiss epiphenomenalism about phenomenal consciousness. And there are sort of interesting debates about whether self-knowledge, phenomenal self-knowledge, is possible if epiphenomenalism about consciousness is true. I think the short answer is that it really is possible in some sense. I've sort of explored this issue in a recent paper, but if I'm allowed, I kind of want to make an ad hominem point here. So the reason why I think epiphenomenalism about phenomenal self-knowledge is not paradoxical is actually well accepted by some philosophers who are actually very friendly to either panpsychism or Russellian monism more generally. So in the account of phenomenal knowledge that we see in works of David Chalmers or Eugene Nagasawa, we don't really have any sort of paradoxical results about phenomenal self-knowledge and epiphenomenalism. For these reasons, I think it is a little bit too quick to dismiss dualism from a panpsychist point of view for its sort of alleged implication of dualism. Now, so far I've said, look, the negative part of the causal argument seems to, in some sense, fail, because I think we can't really dismiss dualism because of its problems with mental causation from a panpsychist point of view. Now, I want to discuss whether we have a satisfactory explanation of mental causation in the Russellian panpsychist picture in the first place. And I kind of want to raise a number of worries with the explanation that we are given here. So first of all, what is the explanation here? So how is sort of these RM properties, which are phenomenal properties, how are these properties sort of causally relevant, and how do they explain mental causation? So when I look at this literature, I see that sort of people are switching between two connected strategies. So these are the grounding strategy and inheritance strategy. I'm going to talk about these two strategies in turn. So I should also add here that, of course, some of this literature is really recent, and you will see that some of the references are to papers from this year, right? So it is conceivable that there could be more strategies forthcoming, but I'm going to limit this discussion to what I have seen in the literature so far. Okay, so the grounding strategy is this. Consciousness, in this view, is causally relevant because phenomenal RM properties ground physical dispositions. So mentality then has a grounding role in causation. Just to prove that I'm not making this up, there's some textual evidence from Alter and Coleman in a very recent paper in the Routledge Handbook of Panpsychism, I think. So panpsychist Russellian monism is designed to accord consciousness a crucial role in physical causation, namely the role of categorically grounding physical dispositional properties. So I'm going to raise a number of limitations of this strategy. So the first one is a very minor limitation. I think sort of you can really probably work around that, but I think it needs to be said, namely that the role in this strategy that consciousness is given is really a grounding role rather than a causal role. So they sort of consciousness is in some sense grounding certain causal powers of certain entities. So from this, it doesn't at least sort of very, very straightforwardly follow that phenomenal states sort of figure as causes in certain cases of mental causation. But as I said, this is really a minor worry. I think a slightly more worrisome issue here is that even if we are okay with this idea of phenomenal properties grounding causal powers, the properties here that are doing the grounding work are not our phenomenal properties, right? So the properties that sort of ground causal powers are properties that are instantiated by, in some sense, micro physical entities. So here, epiphenomenalist philosopher William Robinson sort of makes similar remarks about sort of how Russellian monism more generally sort of can't really be distinguished from epiphenomenalism when it comes to mental causation. And I think I'm in broad agreement with his conclusion, although I'm not entirely sure if I agree with everything he says. But the point, I think, is this: the relevant grounds here are RM properties. That is how we sort of describe this view. And these RM properties are properties of fundamental physical entities like quarks and so on. So you might think that this is very good news for quarks and photons and so on, that their mental properties are causally relevant. But from this, it doesn't really follow that our mental properties are causally relevant. So this strategy, I think, shows that only micro-phenomenal properties, phenomenal properties of micro entities, are causally relevant. Now, the next problem here is sort of built upon this one, but I think it's a more serious problem. And this is where things will get a bit sort of connected with the negative part of the causal argument for panpsychism. So given that in that negative part, we've seen that the reason why dualism is found unsatisfactory has something to do with the causal exclusion argument. I think it would be fair to assume that Russellian panpsychists who give the sort of the the causal argument for Russellian panpsychism sort of endorse the relevant premises of that argument. So one of those premises was that the one that we talked about, the causal closure of the physical. So every physical event that has a cause seems to have a sufficient physical cause. Now, when you sort of put that premise or the principle together with the idea that micro or fundamental physical properties are phenomenal, micro-phenomenal properties, you get a slightly curious picture where every physical event that has a cause has a micro-phenomenal property instance as a sufficient cause. Here, I'm going to take micro-phenomenal properties to include sort of certain sort of conjunctions or certain structural properties that include micro-phenomenal properties as their parts as well. So the idea is that if the causal closure of the physical holds and the fundamental physical properties are phenomenal, micro-phenomenal properties, then in some sense, micro-phenomenal properties should do all the causal work in physical causation, which might be fine if you didn't endorse the exclusion principle, but exclusion principle is also part of the picture. So once you put the exclusion principle, the causal exclusion principle, and this what I call the panpsychist causal closure of the physical, you get this slightly curious result that micro-phenomenal properties actually causally exclude our phenomenal properties. Now, the second problem that I talked about wasn't as serious, because that just said that, look, it shows that micro-phenomenal properties are causally relevant. But with the exclusion principle, now we get this result that that actually macro-phenomenal properties are phenomenal properties, like our pains and conscious experiences and so on and so forth. These are not causally relevant. I think this is a more serious problem insofar as you accept the general exclusionist reasoning about mental causation. And I think because of the claims we have seen in the first part of the talk, I think proponents of the Russellian or proponents of the causal argument for panpsychism do accept those general exclusionist ideas about causation. Well, okay. Now, as I said, I mean, there are different strategies that we find in the recent Russellian panpsychist literature about how this view explains mental causation. And the second one is what I call the inheritance strategy. So the inheritance strategy goes a bit like this, right? So the idea is that macro level phenomenal consciousness, so our conscious experiences and their sort of conscious properties or phenomenal properties, these things are causal efficacious because they inherit causal efficacy from RM properties, which are causal efficacious. And this is why this strategy is really sort of linked in some sense with the first one. So the idea here is that in the previous strategy, my worry was that, well, that strategy really explains something that we don't really have to explain in some sense, namely micro level phenomenal or mental causation. Now, this strategy is supposed to show that actually we can explain macro level phenomenal consciousness too. So here, in joint work again, sort of with Philip Goff and Sam Coleman, say by grounding physical dispositional properties, special categorical properties directly relevant to the grounding of consciousness, and thus macro level consciousness itself get intimately involved in physical causation. So because of the sort of the categorical grounding of RM properties, of certain dispositional properties, macro level consciousness sort of inherits sort of causal efficacy in physical causation, and that's sort of a way in which macro level causation gets intimately involved in physical causation. In the recent paper on Russellian monism, not necessarily on Russellian Panpsychism, but I think the idea is very similar. Alter and Coleman say macrophenomenal properties in this picture inherit physical efficacy. And that is where I actually borrowed the term inheritance from this claim. Now, I think it is somewhat clear that, you know, if this strategy works, then some of the worries that I raised about the grounding strategy can be sort of responded to. So those problems, I think. So, for example, the exclusion problem, you can probably solve that problem by showing that, look, macro level properties are not causally excluded because they, after all, inherit causal efficacy. Now, the issue is that I'm not really sure if this strategy works, because actually I'm not really sure how this strategy works. But I think the worry might be, as I said, this is really recent stuff, and maybe with more work on this, we will perhaps get a sort of more transparent way of explaining how this inheritance strategy works. But I think so far it is just not very clear how macro level consciousness gets intimately involved in physical causation by just being grounded in certain RM properties. But let's say that this strategy works. Let's just assume that it works. Because, as I said, so it's imaginable that there will be an account of how this might work. Well, this is sort of the dialectical problem that I'm going to raise, which again is sort of linked with the first part of the talk. I think if our standards for explanation of mental causation are such that such an inheritance strategy can work in the case of Russellian Panpsychism, I think the dualist should be sort of given the same standards when she's explaining mental causation. And the idea here is that I think a dualist can explain mental causation in a similar way if she wanted to, by appealing to an inheritance strategy. I should first of all here clarify that I am not defending dualism, and I'm not saying that this is how mental causation works. All I'm saying is that if inheritance in general is allowed, I think something like that should work for dualism too. So the idea I have in mind is something like this. This is not very original. This is, I think, the standard picture to some extent. So the dualist can argue that macrophenomenal properties inherit causal efficacy from physical properties and psychophysical laws. So in some sense, the dualist and the Russellian panpsychist would be sort of disagreeing on what the inheritance base is. But as far as the idea of inheritance is acceptable, then this strategy should work. So the idea here is that if dualism is true, these psychophysical laws are going to be contingent fundamental laws. And I think, again, if dualism is true, I think these macro-phenomenal properties are going to figure in these laws in an indispensable way. There's a lot of if there, but as I said, if dualism is true, this seems to be one way of understanding what is going on. Now, I don't think that Russellian panpsychists would be in a good position to dismiss this explanation here, because by relying on the categorical dispositional distinction, I think they are making room for the view that contingent laws can grant causal powers of properties. Once you have that in your toolkit, I think you can actually get a causal efficacy for macro-phenomenal properties in the dualist picture. So in this view, then macro-phenomenal properties can be deemed causal efficacious. And I think in comparison with the inheritance strategy of Russellian panpsychism, this strategy is at least intelligible. It doesn't have to be true in some sense. As I said, on the assumption that dualism is going to be acceptable, I think an explanation like this should be also acceptable too. So this really means that in some sense, the inheritance strategy doesn't put Russellian panpsychism in a superior position when it comes to explaining mental causation, which really sums up the overall conclusion of the paper as well, which is that the superiority of panpsychism in its Russellian form, clearly, over dualism is, I think, illusory, right? So this sort of supports a somewhat conservative conclusion in the following sense. So there's a sense in which the traditional narrative in metaphysics of mind is that the standard non-physicalist theory is dualism. So we contrast physicalism with dualism. And I think what the contemporary literature on panpsychism shows is that I think some proponents of that view are trying to change that narrative. And if the arguments of this paper, I think, are right, I think we can resist that push. So that is the sort of the conservative conclusion. So what does this mean for panpsychism more generally? I think it means that, first of all, I think we should take panpsychism seriously. So I'm not sort of proposing a dismissive attitude to panpsychism, particularly in its Russellian version, because I think it's a very interesting view and it is metaphysically very sophisticated. There's a lot to learn from how they understand consciousness and how it relates to the physical world. But if you really want to change the narrative that dualism shouldn't, I mean, if you want to change the narrative in such a way that panpsychism becomes the standard non-physicalist theory, I think we need to look elsewhere. I think the argument from mental causation doesn't really work. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.